Boom! We're back. Welcome to Minitip Monday. My name's LPV, this is Break Magazine, and you are watching another Minitip Monday. This week on Minitip Monday, we're going to cover the basics of motorcycle suspension, and more importantly, adjusting the spring tension in the front and the rear of your bike to keep it balanced, and we're going to talk about why that is phenomenally important for the handling of your bike. I really like talking about suspension. I can do it for hours and hours without breathing. So for that very reason, we're going to put a time cap on this. We're trying to maintain the mini tip scenario here. So right up there, we're going to throw 3 minutes. Talk about the balance of a bike a lot in our bike reviews. We talk about changing preload a lot too. We do this because it's extremely important for the handling of your bike. To understand why it's important, you need to understand what we're talking about when we say balance. To help me demonstrate, I've got this snazzy little model here. It's Jeremy McGrath, 7-time Supercross champion, one of the greatest motorcycle riders of all time in radio-controlled form. But the beauty of this is that he's got full suspension scenario. Put this coffee here. First up, Jeremy's in a strange riding position, so we'll ignore that. It's actually pretty appropriate to riding adventure bikes because most of the time your body weight is a little bit behind the foot pegs, which is why quite often you need to adjust preload because you're loading the shock up in a different way to how you normally would be. Now, essentially when we're talking about balance, we're referring to how the bike sits when we're riding it and how the suspension compresses. This is controlled by the spring rate and the amount of preload on the spring. You can adjust the spring tension by adding or removing preload on the spring, and doing that makes the spring stiffer or less stiff. So you might ask why this matters. It matters a huge amount because it affects the handling of our bike massively. The amount we weigh in our riding kit, plus hydration packs and luggage and so on, is always different. I weigh different from you, from the next guy, from Neil, and any other the team members. We all weigh different. We weigh different kit that weighs different amounts, different size camelbacks. We carry different amounts of luggage and so on. Hence why we need to adjust that preload, or even in some more extreme cases, the physical springs to match our weight on the bike. Most bikes are designed to fit someone around 80 kilos in their riding kit, so between 75 and 80. If you're like me, you're not even close. I'm not even within a ballpark of that. If we look at Jeremy here, when we rest him down, he's sat pretty level and the suspension generally holds up quite a lot. He's got a little bit of a fork issue here, but we're going to pretend like that's not a thing. So if we imagine that suddenly Jeremy was carrying a load of luggage on the back of his bike, or he was actually 10 kilos heavier than he really is, you start to get this effect where the back of the bike squats down, and as it squats, you'll notice that the fork starts to change its steering angle. The steering angle becomes slacker, and the negative of that, the reason we don't want that, is that it makes the bike much harder to turn. As soon as you go from here, to that position, everything falls apart. The other downside to this as well is that when we've got all this weight on the back of the bike and the suspension's not held up in its proper position, and we've lost the geometry of the bike, you also have the rear shock sitting much lower in its stroke. When it sits low in its stroke, it's actually in a much stiffer part of the internal valving. When it's in a stiffer part of the stroke, it makes it feel harsh, it feels horrible, you lose all the plushness at the start of the suspension stroke. Neither of those things, having a bad handling bike or suspension that feels horrible, are particularly desirable characteristics. So what you're looking for is to bring back the balance of the bike to stock, to get that bike to handle exactly as the engineers that designed it intended it to handle. You want, when you push on the middle of the bike and you go through nice big bumps, both ends of the suspension to go down together, not one moving quicker than the other. And you want that geometry of the steering angle to be as close to stock as possible. That way you get the bike that the engineers intended to have, and you can start to improve it beyond there if you need to. But situation one is always get that preload and that balance sorted for the amount of weight that you're carrying on the bike. So the next part of this is figuring out how to change it and figure out how much you need to change your bike by. I'm going to put Jeremy back over here. So how do you know how to figure out what the engineers originally wanted? Well, it's kind of a few options. Quite often you'll find in your rider's manual it tells you the appropriate amount of sag required for the front and rear shock. But otherwise you've got 3 options. Option 1 is to buy an R1200 GS from 2017 onwards with their kind of super clever dynamic ESA system with automatic sag adjustment or preload adjustment. It's a really clever option. It basically calculates everything as you ride away for how much weight you've got on the bike, and then you leave it alone and you don't do anything else, and you get the bike that's you're meant to have. Whoa, that was exciting. If you're 75 to 85 kilos in riding gear, you're probably pretty close to the mark anyway of what it comes out the factory. So you can always go down the route of fiddling with it, seeing what it feels like, and trying to improve it just by feel. So add a bit of preload, see how it handles. If it turns a bit quicker and feels better, that's a good thing. If it goes a bit jackknifey and turns in too quickly and feels unstable, that's not so good, and all of the behaviors in the other way. The third option is to start measuring. Now this is the most scientific way, it's definitely the best option. As a general rule, a bike's suspension should compress about 1/3 of the travel with you sat in the riding position in all your riding gear, half tank of fuel, your luggage, whatever you're taking with you. 1/3 is a really, really good guideline for what your suspension should compress. If you're there or thereabouts, you're probably pretty close to where you should be. Now, the process of measuring the sag and the amount of drop in your suspension is something that you kind of need to be shown. The best way, throw it into Google. The first couple of guides that come up are spot on. They give you a really good idea of the measurements you should be achieving. And the last point of note is that we focus mostly on rear suspension because it is the most common point that needs addressing. Most of the time you get on a bike, if you're a bit heavy for it, it's the rear shock that collapses, and it's the rear one that has the easiest preload adjustment. But it's not an issue that's exclusive to the rear suspension. You can also change the preload in a lot of bikes, forks or front end, and again, it makes a really, really big difference. You're essentially making the front end stiffer and sit up more. If you weigh substantially more than the average person, you know, if we're talking like you weigh 95, 100, maybe 105 kilos with kit, then we're starting to get into the realms of you needing to change quite a lot in the suspension to get those spring rates right. Now, the beauty of most adventure bikes is that the springs are already quite stiff, and the preload changes make a really, really big difference. So something like a 1200 GS or a KTM, the spring will cover a range from a 70 kilo rider to someone who's more like 110 with a pillion or 110 plus luggage, you know, so, you know, the total rider luggage weight could be over 200 kilos, and they can kind of deal with that wide range. It's not ideal, but they're pretty well set up for that scenario because they're designed to work in a broad spectrum of scenarios. Suspension is a phenomenally in-depth subject, and we're pretty much just blowing the dust off the front cover of a book there. That said, getting the balance of the bike right is always the first place to start. So if you're loading your bike up with luggage or you're carrying a pillion, try fiddling with that preload adjuster on the rear shock. Add some preload in, try to get the bike so it's more balanced than it would be otherwise, so that it comes back to being nice and level and everything's working together. You'll be surprised how much of a huge difference that makes to the handling of a bike. And quite often you'll find that even if you're struggling with your bike in general, adding a little bit of preload in to bring that balance back and get it to turn a little bit better makes a huge difference. And if you like this video, by now you should know what to do. Hit that like button. Throw a comment down below. If you've got any questions about some of the handling characteristics you're struggling with your bike, pop it in the comments. Let us know. We'll do our best to give our advice. We're going to be around in the comments for a few hours. And remember, guys, life's better when you're riding.